Hello, everybody. I spoke to Joe Sestak, who is a Democratic presidential candidate. If you haven't heard of him, or if you're only vaguely aware of him, you're probably not alone. He hasn't gotten a huge amount of media attention, and he entered the race quite late in June. But on paper, you'd think he'd at least be somebody who would garner a fair hearing. He was a member of Congress from Pennsylvania from 2007 to 2011. He ran for the Senate twice. In 2016, when he ran, he was opposed quite vigorously by the Democratic Party establishment, and he shares some thoughts on that. And he was also a high-ranking admiral for many years, and therefore witnessed firsthand many of the war theaters that are currently up for debate in terms of policy. So I'm of the mind that even if you have a, quote, minor candidate or somebody who's not making headlines, if at all possible, you should hear them out and ask probing questions where appropriate. So that's what I did, and I was glad to have spoken to him in New Hampshire this week. We got into a variety of interesting issues. So here we go. All right. Hello, Joe Sestak.
Good to be with you, Michael.
Thank you for doing this.
Good to be aboard.
So I went to an event in Bow, New Hampshire over the weekend where you spoke. And I think you mentioned that you spent something like 65 days, 60 days in
Just about.
In an Econo Lodge.
That's correct.
In Iowa?
That's right. And the room's still waiting for me. We settled in there. We got a great best rate you could get in Des Moines, and it's going under construction. And it's had its benefits. The manager of it has taken me, I think it's about a week and a half from now, to his Into Temple to meet the community.
Oh, okay.
And a wonderful Hispanic population. Workers have been reconstructing the place, which is part of the reason I mentioned we got a great deal. And they've passed out already 1,000 oral brochures, and they're bringing together 200 of them for me to meet with them. So I've got my Asian Pacific Latino community. Hispanic.
Have you secured the endorsement of the Econo Lodge manager?
Well, actually, the manager actually is my Iowan Asian Pacific head of Outreach.
Oh, okay.
Seriously,
Wow.
He's officially as the head of it, and has agreed to do it. So it's really wonderful.
I brought that up in part because I've been staying here in New Hampshire in an Econo Lodge, so I felt as though I could relate. Although, I'm sure it's not that many presidential candidates have such glamorous accommodations. So you're special in that regard.
But it is special because my wife said, you make sure you stay at some place that has a breakfast included in the morning. So
it's a meager breakfast.
It's a pretty big...
It's not much of a breakfast, but it's something. Okay, so at the event over the weekend, came up and chatted briefly, and one thing you said I was a little jarred by, so I wanted to get you to clarify. You said we created ISIS, meaning the United States, and then you said that you should have maybe said that in a little more of a nuanced way, but to what extent do you assign direct culpability to the U.S. for the creation of ISIS? How do you parse that out?
If the United States of America had not invaded Iraq, we would not have had ISIS. Because those Democrats and senators, as I said at the event you were at, who voted for that tragic misadventure in Iraq, had little understanding of the world. They had little understanding that militaries can stop a problem, but they never fix a problem. And they had no understanding that if you're going to use our military, it'd be better to understand how it's going to end before it began. And on that issue, they had no idea that Sunni and Shia were being unleashed against each other when we went in. And the former generals of Saddam Hussein, then, as we kicked them out of their jobs, went and helped form ISIS. That sequence of events, from our politicians voting for that war, has led to ISIS having metastasized into Syria and beyond, even copycat killings throughout Europe and into Los Angeles. So I do believe that you need a commander-in-chief of this nation where you have a change that is great this now with a rising authoritarian China and autocrats from everywhere, from Hungary to Poland to Venezuela, Brazil to Philippines, back to Turkey. You need someone who understands the world and knows how to convene the world for peace and prosperity. Understanding the military has a role to stop anything that's going to harm us, but there are other ways through diplomacy, the power of our economy, we can actually make sure justice is done in the world. And so, yes, if we had not entered that war, ISIS would not have occurred, because then, as General Petraeus said himself, that we created more terrorists by that conflict.
So I think when you use the formulation, we created ISIS, it would be perhaps reasonable for somebody to infer that you are assigning almost intentionality, in the sense that there was some design where the U.S. in invading maybe knew or they wanted to foment that kind of hatred?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. They just didn't understand the world, the president and the Democrats and Republicans. Look, I visited over 80 countries. I was in the Navy for 31 years. I worked for President Clinton in the White House, developing our nation's national security strategy, coordinating it. I understood the elements of our power. I mean, it's why they sent me to Harvard University to begin my study process, having a doctorate in both national security and economics. No, I saw nothing except just people who just didn't know. And so that's really the issue.
Because I almost feel like that could be a cop-out in certain circumstances, where you feign ignorance about an easily predictable consequence of your decision-making. I've been researching this time period, 2003, for some stories I'm working on, and I read a speech from Ted Kennedy in 2002 when he explicitly warned that this would incite the Muslim world and create new terrorist groups. So it's not as though that was a fringe notion. So I almost wonder, as though kind of just accepting that they were well-intentioned but maybe didn't understand the world that they were engaging in gives them an out or absolves them of responsibility.
But I don't think you can impart to them that they knew that they would create ISIS, or that there was a plan to create ISIS. I think that's reaching into kind of conspiracy theory types of an approach. I commend men or women that understood the world, like Ted Kennedy expressed. But you remember how often that people had various reasons of why they did or didn't do this. But the real shame of it all, and why I am running, is not one of them has ever said, I want to be accountable for what I voted for. That's not the only reason of accountability that drove me into this race. Who's ever been held accountable for unleashing Wall Street, removing regulations that permitted them to do damage for the Great Recession? And so that's the reason I'm running, is to say, wait a moment, we've lost faith in our governmental leaders because none of them want to be accountable. In the Navy, when the captain of a ship has his ship go aground, or else the crew comes to harm, he is relieved or she is relieved for cause, no questions asked. Because if the captain is ever felt by the crew that he or she is above accountability for what damage they do, you lose trust from the crew, and the ship disintegrates into chaos. That is what has happened today, is hundreds voted for that war or dismantled Wall Street. The carnage of both livelihoods and lives from those two tragic votes is where people lost faith, and you can see the good United States ship of state becoming a little bit into disorder. I'm running so that people know that I will always be accountable to them above party, as I did when I ran against my party's desires, against then Republican turned Democrat Arlen Specter, who was permitted to annihilate Anita Hill, who had brought sexual harassment claims about now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. But I also knew that in a nearly 2-to-1 Republican district, that if I could work well, even with a very progressive record, an F from the NRA, NARAL Polk Choice 100%, Human Rights Campaign 95%, National Organization 100%, that we could disagree well because they trusted me, because they knew I'd always be accountable to them above party, self, or any special interests. That's what we need today.
So speaking of the lack of accountability that was ever doled out for the people who facilitated, in particular, the Iraq War, I had the opportunity a few days ago to speak to Joe Biden. And he, as you know, was one of the Democratic senators who voted for the authorization of the use of force in Iraq in 2002. And he is now sort of spinning a little bit of a tale where he's insisting that he was somehow opposed to the Iraq War, either before it began or shortly after it began. Actually, when he spoke to me, and I have a piece coming out on this soon, he said that he was opposed to it before it started, which doesn't make sense in hindsight given his contemporaneous statements that anybody can go and find. So does the fact that he is, and I'm not trying to goad you into egregiously attacking anyone, but I think it's a serious issue. Does the fact that he is, leading the polls in the Democratic primary race, yet still has this blemish on his record, what does that tell you about the accountability mechanism that's never really been invoked on this issue in particular?
It is the reason I am running. With all due respect to the vice president and those other Democrats and Republicans who voted to authorize war, there is no excuse that a man or woman who wants to be a leader of men and women in the service, and neither should a politician who wants to lead our nation ever give an excuse for having cast a vote that led to the tragedy of Iraq. I remember arriving in that Arabian Sea, and there were 20 ships there that joined my 10 for the strikes against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But I was told to take a left turn, so to speak, through the Straits of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf to begin the precursor strikes against Iraq. Only 2 of those countries went with us because they understood that our leaders at the time, not one of them, could explain how it would end.
What were the precursor strikes? What did that mean exactly?
What happened is that Saddam Hussein's forces, after the first Gulf War, his aircraft ground were not to be below a certain latitude. I think it was 42, 45, I've forgotten the exact one. But he would often play cat and mouse. And so he would break what had been established years before. And we would retaliate, as we told him he would, both against that plane or any onerous types of military facilities nearby. So those were called precursor strikes.
So that was before the invasion.
That is correct. They're the precursor strikes. But I bring that up because it is this lack of accountability that, look, I know I voted for that war, but I didn't. But I have an excuse for why I did. Or, look, I was part of the team that let some of the regulations and the oversight of Wall Street get loosened. But I never, ever feel I need to say I was accountable. There's a wonderful Wall Street Journal editorial written in 1952 called Hobson's Choice. I used that phrase when I spoke the other day, where this article talks about the one place where accountability still matters, because it's been lost in 52, it said, in our political life, in our civil life. But there's one place where this tradition of accountability is a tradition that's older than even our country, and it talks about the sea and the Navy. to where a captain knows that if he or she goes aground or harms come to crew, as I said, he or she accepts that there is no excuse. Even if they're sleeping as that ship goes aground, they were responsible, that captain, for training the crew that they wouldn't. That's why there is such a lack of trust, this unaccountable leadership. It is what I truly believe led to Mr. Trump being elected. The system wasn't accountable to them, and they just cast a vote, many of them, to break the system. That's why I said Mr. Trump's not the problem. He is the symptom of a problem. More than anything else, we must repair that, or else we can't meet the challenges of our time.
I mean, just for the record, I want to give you the exact quote from Joe Biden to me personally. Quote, "Yes, I did oppose the war before it began." I almost don't know how to respond to that, right? It's a blatant revision or retelling or just a distortion, arguably, of history, and this person is leading the polls. So if you want to talk about accountability, there's got to be some accountability for that kind of distortion.
His words speak quite well for themselves, because it also says, and that is why, again, I'm running, is this nation yearns for someone to be accountable for what they do, not what they say, for what they actually do, and has demonstrated it. And that's why I got in this race. I didn't see someone who had good people demonstrated accountability when there was going to be consequences for oneself. That's when it matters. But though you have to be willing to bear the consequences for a wrong decision.
So here's a decision that you made, which in hindsight could potentially be regarded as wrong. I want to see if you agree. In 2009, President Obama announced that he was going to be instituting a troop surge in Afghanistan. You supported that surge. It resulted in the deadliest year on record for U.S. troops in Afghanistan in 2010, 2011. And to what strategic end? Don't quite know. Doesn't appear to have been per se successful. You said at the time that the benchmarks for success would be whether the conditions which contributed to al-Qaeda getting safe harbor in Afghanistan were addressed. That doesn't appear to be the case. The Taliban still has huge territorial control in Afghanistan. So 10 years on, was that a mistake?
No. And I say that because in a closed meeting with Congressman before I supported it, Mr. Gates briefed us.
The defense secretary.
That is correct. And what he said is those 40,000 troops would be used like a door to keep the Taliban, not al-Qaeda, we were already most of them out of Afghanistan, to keep the Taliban in Pakistan, because Pakistan was causing the problem of funneling them, supporting them. And so what he said, which is why I then supported it, is they would be like a metal fence that would prevent them to come in as we trained and settled in secure positions, and also used what needed to fix that terrorism from coming back, which is developmental aid and other aspects, such as fixing the illiteracy rate of women. So he also said we would have measured milestones and would be able to show this working. So when the assistant secretary was a deputy assistant secretary of policy came in months later at the Armed Services Committee, and I asked if she could walk us through those milestones. We weren't given them. So the objective as a military man was the correct one. If there were just 40,000 to throw in there, no. But there actually, you could understand that that's where the problem was at that time. Al-Qaeda had been kicked out. It was the Taliban coming back that we had to stop. And you didn't do that by parsing forces all over the area. They were going to be on a straight line like this, we were told in the closed meeting. Then, at testimony, the Armed Services Chairman said, when asked, how do you handle Afghanistan and Iraq? And he said in testimony, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. That was the second major change from how you do war. When you're in war, you do what you must. In fact, Winston Churchill said it well. Sometimes it's not enough to do what's required. Your best. You must do what's required. So, no, at that time, that was the right strategy to try to finish that war in terms of fixing the society to give us time, which we lost the first time the war happened because I was on the ground there at the beginning of the war. It was done quite well, and Al-Qaeda got removed, which was the objective. Then they started bringing in the civil affairs forces, those parts of the military that help a society have security and help them then evolve into a stable community. And then Iraq happened. And we took our time, our focus, and we took our forces that were supposed to do this in there. So when Secretary Gates came in and said, now we can close the door on the Taliban to give us time to do this, it was doing what should have been done if we hadn't gone to that tragic war. Unfortunately, the milestones never were given public.
But if the milestones were never given public, or if they were never met, or if they were never promulgated to members of Congress so they could assess them independently, doesn't that call into question the wisdom of the decision itself?
Not at all.
Because it says that the decision wasn't implemented in a way that was either competent or constructive, or there was some flaw in the decision-making process.
I don't know if there was a flaw in the decision-making process, because then when the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff says, we just do what we can there, perhaps there was this acknowledgement finally that they aren't going to be able to achieve what those milestones are in order to do it. That's why I said there was two elements in it. So when you're in war, at least when I would subscribe to and my exposure was limited in the war. You know, I commanded carry a battle group. Before Iraq, I was on the ground. I went back on the ground for a brief period, very brief. I mean, it was that second time was. We were doing things that the first two times I felt were spot on how a war should be conducted. Flew out, get the job done, the missions, you knew what everything had to be done. The second time I went there was after Iraq had happened. And you could just feel that issues had actually turned towards secondary in Afghanistan, first in Iraq. Don't know if I was right because I was there for a brief period. But then when the chairman said, no, in Afghanistan we do what we can, not what we must. So, yeah, we changed evidently the priority of how to do things. And I think that is probably what failed. It was a good strategy because it was exactly what we could have done when we initially went in and we had Al-Qaeda out. The Taliban weren't running back in. And if we could have secured that area, and by security, I don't mean just with the military. The most successful, as you've heard me talk about, military stop a problem. And we did stop it. We moved Al-Qaeda out. It's the other elements of our power that fix the problem. You've heard me talk about the illiteracy rate of women, which was 98%. It's in my book that if we had done that, we would have done more to fix the global war of terror than our military after years of war have been able to stop it. That plan to give that bulwark against Taliban was the right plan, or just get out.
I think, again, 10 years later, where we're now approaching the literal anniversary for when a service member could be deployed to Afghanistan who was born after 9/11, as many are noting, still sustaining American casualties in Afghanistan. The Taliban has regained substantial territorial control. You just have to look back at that time period and question whether it was sound decision making, right? I mean, I know you have an argument as to why you thought it was valid and maintained such, but 10 years on, I mean, what was the purpose of all that? I think people are asking themselves, the war's gone on for 18 years, they've had withdrawals and then surges and withdrawals and surges under different presidents. For what?
But that's exactly why I am running. Not just to be president, but commander-in-chief. Because if that strategy, which was the right strategy, had been there when I was commander-in-chief, we wouldn't have done what we can. We would have done what we had to do to execute it. And so I didn't have command of that, but I do very much want to. It's why I also know that as we left that place, we needed to leave behind elements of stability. We missed 2 chances. The greatest of import was when that tragedy in Iraq took us out of Afghanistan in terms of attention, in terms of resources, and it was no longer a priority. As I said to a senior military officer, why are we doing this and splitting our forces and not just finishing the job? The second time was that bulwark became of second priority of what we can instead of we must. They needed to be given the resources. And part of that you can see is very few of those who have led during those wars ever would bring Afghanistan out into public a lot. It was almost like, here's what we're doing, and then those milestones were never articulated of how they had done it. Do I think they had them? I think, of course, you wouldn't have been told that. I think they're honest people. But when you then say, well, we're just going to have to do what we can, well, how do you meet a milestone with what you can, not what you must?
So in this 2020 cycle, we've reached a point where men and women who served in the post 9/11 wars are of age where they can be running for president. There have been a few. Seth Moulton ran and he dropped out, but Tulsi Gabbard is still in the race. She served in the Iraq War, and she's now a staunch critic of U.S. foreign policy writ large. What kind of unique contribution do you think somebody like her can bring, who she served in the wars that the policymakers pronounce upon but don't have any firsthand experience with? Is there an added dimension that somebody with that background
I
can
think
bring?
anyone who has served brings an extra dimension to it.
But especially a critic of the policy.
Oh, I think critics are necessary to it. I believe that we have made mistakes in foreign policy, like Iraq. But I was forthright that Afghanistan was the right decision. The execution of it after we went to Iraq is what, they also said, that the chairman, I believe, that's how Afghanistan spiraled south. I think that's also quoted by the chairman because of, I try to find that quote for you, okay? But
Okay.
It was either him or another person. And so it was that second war that caused that first decision not to be executed well, even after they put the bulwark strategy in. Again, that was always it. So when you criticize that, absolutely. But when you step back and have someone who has a length and a breadth of global experience in it, I mean, Seth Moulton, I went to see him. He was peerless. I would claim, as I told him, that you've done more in your tours than I ever did in my 31 years. I acknowledge that. What a man. But what I bring to the table is the length and breadth of that service, serving in the White House to see how all our elements come together, developing, coordinate the national security strategy to see how we can best embark within the world of foreign policy. And she's right. I don't know exactly what she's saying, but that if you're using our military to just do a preventive war like we did in Iraq, you're wrong. We made a mistake. with all that ties back in the 60s with Vietnam. But there, without a question, it has been our foreign policy that overall, and I would say it's our national security strategy, because there's no really any more barriers between foreign and domestic policies. It's really a national security strategy, has been under a global concord that we built that brought together a liberal world order that was based upon individual values of individual and human rights, open and fair markets, fair and just governments, but also embraced the collective good that was responsible for whether it was Stalinism or human rights atrocities, global recessions, or if it was poverty. We actually brought together those nations who had similar types of values in multilateral agreements and structures, and we won the third World War, the Cold War, without a shot. We had not built in our national security strategy or foreign policy, some calls it, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank. And it was because of that we were able, for example, to stymie the recession, the Great Recession in Europe, where when the Great Depression happened in between World War I and World War II, that led to the rise of fascism in the Second World War. That liberal world order that we built, that we're now retreating from, actually brought the extreme poverty from 63% at the end of World War II to 8% today. It was actually that brought literacy rate from about 35% all the way up to near 70. It's what brought longevity, how long you can expect to live, from about 40-some years to about 70 years. It didn't just happen. It was our foreign policy that made mistakes at time, backed by the military, and wrongly the military was used at times because people didn't understand. We don't fix problems. We stop them if something's endangering us. How could a projectile about 20 inches long that only goes 12 miles in Iraq that might have and didn't carry chemicals endanger us? And that was the fallacy. And so the point is right, that war is what caused people to have lack of faith, not just in U.S. leadership, but our engagement in the world. And the change, and that's the second reason I'm running. If we don't restore U.S. leadership to this national security structure, there is the rise of an illiberal world order that has actually incarcerated its Muslim Uyghur citizens. You can see the damage and the threat against Hong Kong that it is doing to now, that has actually forced Cambodia and Djibouti to give it ports for its naval forces to get out of the predatory loans that it had given us. We don't have to go to war for that, but we have to bring the world together to make sure that injustice doesn't harm us.
Let me just interject. The reason why I brought up Congresswoman Gabbard is because she has taken her military experience and formulated it into a worldview that questions some of the very premises behind U.S. foreign policy, not just Iraq. She talks about Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, all manner of other engagements. And perhaps even that would incorporate a rejection or a skepticism, at least, of some of these, what you might call a fanciful, sentimental attachment to the U.S., to the liberal world order with the U.S. as the global hegemon. I mean, a lot of people are very skeptical of that notion across the spectrum. So how do you react to that? I mean, especially somebody with her standing and using the perch of having experienced these wars firsthand to formulate a critique that's a little bit maybe more systemic and structural than the one you are proffering.
Well, what I would say is, first, I always respect, I've talked to her once in my life, but it was obvious that she's an extraordinarily smart woman, and grateful for her service. But I would also say, how are we going to deal with China like Trump is dealing with China? That is actually stealing, according to the former head of the National Security Agency, $300 billion a year of our intellectual property. that is, according to the European Union, Japan, and others, and us, that is actually is disrupting the marketplace and against the rules of the World Trade Organization, having state-owned, subsidized companies that are able to compete unfairly with us. Well, Mr. Trump has decided that you do it one-on-one. Just throw some scattershot tariffs. As I hear is that what I see is America's strongest power is not its military. It's not its economy. It's our ability to convene, to bring together the nations and peoples of the world for a common cause that serves us all. That brought that liberal world. That's what the liberal world is. So what we need to do, as I've said, is, if I could, is take the World Trade Organization that's not working, and just to the words you used, restructure it. And by the way, this is I've spoken with repeatedly. The rules were meant for dumping, not for a mercantile system that is cheating on the rules and is able to, because the rules weren't made for that. So we changed the rules that make sure that a government that is opaque and won't report whether they're subsidizing it, you lower the evidence rules, because that's what the European Union wants, what Japan wants, it's what the TPP nations want, which is 40%. Then you convene the whole world, about 70, 80% of the GDP of the world, and you say, China, look, it's just not America. If you want to trade, because it's not a trade issue, it's a macroeconomic issue, and you say, you want to trade with us, that's okay, we'd like it, but these are the rules that you have to comply with, because you're right. Ever since she got into the WTO, that structure of that part of the liberal world order needs to be redone. It's what we did after NATO did.
Spread cynicism and disillusionment. The way in which the WTO and those other trade entities have been structured has bred cynicism and disillusionment
without a question.
with the liberal world order as on a conceptual level, so people don't believe that it serves their interests.
And that's on my website, by the way.
Okay.
All right? And what I said is, I came
up with that on my own. I didn't plagiarize.
No, you're right.
So, you know.
I actually say that, look, I talk about our international corporations which have taken advantage of organizations like these you mentioned. And I said we have to restructure their corporate commons, because just with the WTO isn't going to do it. Let me give you an example. I say on my website, and I've said it in speeches, I just said it yesterday in Durham at the Public Policy School where I spoke about China. I said, look, our international organizations are outsourcing not just jobs to China, they're outsourcing their national security, because approximately 95% of all computer parts and about 80% of all iPhone parts, the technical are a virtual monopoly there. So if you have an Android today programmed with Chinese software, everything you say goes back to China. Oh, if you saw Bloomberg News report, they have reported that the motherboards meant for servers in Amazon, Apple, Aegis Navy ships, and CIA drones had embedded chips in them, that they could do damage to those servers. So now those servers go to Europe, they go to Japan, they go everywhere. And so what you need to do is, again, convene the world, fix the World Trade Organization, but you've got to restructure Apple that, oh, by the way, you know, you're taking my information every night from me. When I put the iPhone down, as the Washington Post reported, and those apps on it take 550 pieces of my private information off, and you didn't pay me. So as I said, we need to restructure these international organizations because they've taken advantage of a lax government here and abroad in the liberal world order, where European Union was the first one to say, that's wrong. You want our personal data, you got to pay for it, or they got to tell you that you can have it. And so that you're right. But that doesn't mean we don't need to convene the world, because how can we handle something like that unless all of us are in it together against someone who's doing nefarious things?
Yeah.
So restructuring is absolutely right, just like we restructured NATO after the Cold War.
Well, speaking of NATO, that would be another example of a vehicle by which nations are convened toward a common military purpose. And I can still vividly remember the Libya intervention in 2011, which was done at the behest of NATO. And how well did that work?
I agree with you. I went on MSNBC several times and said, I do not support this because our commander-in-chief cannot tell us how it will end. In fact, he didn't tell us what the objective was. At least Mr. Gates, in your example, told us I could support because here's the objective, and I could tell military could work. Remember, you couldn't tell me whether it was the removal of Gaddafi, because people kept questioning this, or is it humanitarian safety for the people in there?
Well, that's what they claimed initially, and
then
morphed
it
into
changed.
a regime change.
And so I didn't support it. I agree with you. Look, I'm not arguing, as you can see in Iraq, or you can see in Libya. And I also argued against troops into Syria, but what I did argue for, because based on Jordan intelligence, which works closely with Israel, that they knew who the secular militia were, and we should be giving them small arms when it was still theirs to take, in a sense, before ISIS grew. And Al-Qaeda became ISIS, parts of them. But we took a year and a half.
But wasn't that the whole moderate rebel fallacy that turned out
Who said
to
it
fall
was a
apart?
fallacy? We waited a year and a half once the decision was made that for the guns to go to them. Time matters when something happens. That's why, you really do. It's like General Colin Powell said one time, or even a civil war says, get there fastest with the mostest. Well, you know what? We waited a year and a half, and then therefore, of course, it didn't work. In the meantime, as I said, ISIS and all grew. But Libya, you're spot on. And the other one was Iraq. So there's no one here saying that our foreign policy is about military strikes. No, that's what happens only when you absolutely last resort.
Yep. So you mentioned Israel. I was watching some of your recent interviews, and you were speaking to local television in the Quad Cities. And you said something that struck me, and I jotted down the quote. You said, quote, "I would have died for Israel. That was my job."
I said that several times, even in years earlier.
Okay. I think some people might hear that and say to themselves, dying for a foreign nation would have been your job as a member of the U.S. military and a high-ranking
We
official?
signed treaties, like with NATO that you mentioned, where we will come to their defense, and they will come to ours, because that's why 20 ships showed up to join my battle group in the Arabian Sea. Japan was there. It hadn't been outside the sea. Japan, she wasn't even NATO. But we had Germany, Italians, and everyone was there because they had signed up to Title 10. I think it was the Article 5, I think, of the NATO treaty, that if one is attacked, we all come and defend them. They would have died for us there. And some did in Afghanistan. And so, yes, for the support of Israel, I left one of my ships there that I commanded, enveloped it into the integrated air defense of Israel before it took my carrier battle group to the Arabian Sea and ultimately to the Persian Gulf, so that if Scud missiles from Iraq happened to be there and rain down on, we could protect it. We sign up to serve our nation and its national security interest, and Israel is one, as NATO is.
Okay, I'm being told you have to wrap up. So one final question here, or we'll come to a conclusion. Why did the Democratic establishment oppose you in 2016 when you ran for the Senate nomination, and they supported your opponent who ended up losing to Senator Toomey in the general election?
My independence. I went to meet the leadership twice down in Washington, D.C. They had not forgiven me for running against Senator Arlen Specter after he switched parties. And I didn't agree because of what he had done to Anita Hill. That was it. I put a video out on this. Mm-hmm. But as I walked across Pennsylvania, and they sought, as you well know, over 7 or 8 people run against me. But in those previous 4 or 5 years, I had taught at 6 universities, turned down the lobbying jobs, and I had done 600-700 events for other Democrats, county chairs, people who are running for prothonotary in Pennsylvania.
I don't even know what that office is.
It makes sure that, for example, some rules and regulations are done. If a woman has a law passed that she can't have a spouse nearby, they enforce that. So, and get it through the court. So it's unique in Pennsylvania. President Truman once asked that question: was it prothonotary?
I'm in good company then.
So I was walking across Pennsylvania then because I felt very strongly in that year that people no longer want to know who I was. They want to know if I went through what they went through. I got 2 calls. One was from a Republican as I walked across the state. He opened up I was in my flight jacket. I was in the press all the time because they were coming to interview me. I had a town hall every day, whether you're on human rights or whether it was on small businesses. And he yelled out at me, "Admiral, I'm a Republican. I love what you're doing." But I got a call a few days later from a senator from New York who runs all the money.
Schumer.
And he said, "Sestak, I told you, stop walking." I said, "Senator," I said, "people, DNA's changed. They want to know that I know what they're going through. And I have to." He said, "Whenever I tell you anything, the only answer is to be yes." I said, "Sorry, sir." And so they sought out someone else. And
not only sought them out, they spent a lot of money helping your opponent in the primary, which is unusual for a party organization.
Some people say that Bernie Sanders, the DNC did certain things with emails. They spent, we know for hard fact, at least $6 million on ads against us. That doesn't count the last week, which is probably another 2, and then all the brochures and the radios. So, but they actually, we do know, the DS, Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, put more millions in on television ads than they put against Mitch McConnell 2 years earlier. So look, this is why, part of the reason I'm running. People want someone who has demonstrated that they are willing to run.
Do you think
to be accountable to people, because the individual they then supported in the year of draining the swamp, Senator Pat Toomey running against her, said, which is right, she was a pharmaceutical lobbyist for a while in the year of draining the swamp, and the Washington establishment didn't get it. And so, I understand that, but the point is, I was very fortunate. My daughter's brain cancer came back, as you know, and that's why I was in late, and I was able to be with her till she got in a safe harbor. So I was fortunate out of it all.
Who did you vote for in the 2016 presidential primary?
Presidential primary who was it at the time?
Hillary and Bernie.
Oh, I had supported Mrs. Hillary in her first race for president, and
you supported her again in 2016?
Yeah, I did. I loved Bernie because I thought he just he brought the mold of all that. But I had served with Mrs. Clinton in the White House. I knew her. I had brought to her 2 issues, because you can't get everything on President Clinton's plate as president. And there was a wonderful Admiral Zumwalt, who is head of the Navy and part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he had voted for Agent Orange. His son was a Marine Corps officer and died of Agent Orange years later. So he used to come to the NSC, and he would ask, see if we could expand, because it's very hard to qualify for Agent Orange in the VA for many, many, many years. Even now, some of the navies who sucked up water from Vietnam aren't qualified. I've been working on that the last couple of years to the gentleman who died of Agent Orange. I was working with him, civilian. So he how to do legislation, submit it down there, to ask him to. And but I went over to Mrs. Clinton's office, and at times she held teas and would have people come in, and agreed to. So Adam went in, VA came in. She didn't do policy, but she'd ask questions. And out of that, as she questioned what was this and all, actually the VA then, about 6-8 months later, opened up. It made it easier for people to get access to treatment in the VA. She was accountable for vets. And so I very much appreciated that.
Why did she lose Pennsylvania to Donald Trump, a reliable Democratic state?
I don't think she would have if I had been running for Senate. I don't like to say that alone, but Pat Toomey's campaign manager said it's hard to believe that they chose someone else than Joe Sestak because he was really in touch with the people. And I would have loved to have been there on the stand as I was in her first race when I supported her as Senate. I would stand on the stage with her and be one of the introducers of her. I'd like to think that I could have helped. But when you had, Senate races affect presidentials, presidentials affect the Senate. And I would have been proud to stand with her. Do I think Bernie did great things? Yes, but I had seen what she had done, and I know the perceptions and all that. And she's also responsible very much for the Women's Veterans Memorial. So, look, and I know that's just a niche here, but, it matters to me. I go to prison every year to visit vets. And
do you think Bernie would have been a stronger candidate in the general election in 2016?
I'd be speculating.
Well,
Who knows what comes up, what doesn't come up, I'm not trying to dodge. I just don't know. I thought she was a fine candidate, and yes, I know. But I didn't endorse her or Bernie because I never endorsed after the President of the United States, decided that Donna Specter was going to be the candidate. I never asked
in 2010, President
Obama. Right, because I didn't want to put anybody between me and a very fine president, So I never asked for endorsements. I take them, someone proffer them. And so I never gave them, sometimes for small races. But I didn't endorse in that because, I was running against my party, and it would have been unfair to have my name associated with her.
Do you think the DNC, as some people claim and some have acknowledged, rigged the primaries in 2016? Or that they were unfairly tilted?
I'm not trying to dodge. I know a little bit of reading about it. I know there was emails going back and forth, but I could say that was mine rigged because they put over $6 million minimum against me? No, it was just politics of an establishment that wanted it its way.
Right.
And therefore they lost Pennsylvania's Senate race, if not the presidential. But I'm not running for that. I'm running because that's the symptom of why people don't trust Washington, D.C. You've heard me tell the Carrier story, right?
I believe so, yeah.
And that's youth can tell everyone by standing in front of that plane, if they didn't do their job, not for their word, for their deed, they were willing for that plane to go through them to their own death. And that was the proof. They were willing to stand there to prove that they had done their job. And that's why I'm running.
Can I ask you something very quickly?
Because I want to stand in front of that plane.
That I observed at the Democratic Convention this past weekend in Manchester that you spoke at. There was one point at which the crowd broke out into a chant of Moscow Mitch, referring to Mitch McConnell.
I didn't see that.
It wasn't while you were speaking.
Okay.
It was while a different candidate was speaking. But this is sort of a tagline now you hear where Mitch McConnell gets pegged as Moscow Mitch and similar stuff. Isn't that sort of foolishness?
Look, here's what I'm saying. I was asked by a person, I can't remember with Vox or Quartz, that said, this is an election people say about outrage. Why aren't you running on outrage? I said, how am I going to govern to unite America? Because I don't think we can do anything except have a president doing executive orders again, and the next one rips it out unless we unite America. Disagreeing well if I'm running on outrage. So, yeah, do I still say, did President Trump not understand that he just broke the peace negotiations that is going to be harmful to our national security? Do I say that he uses incendiary? Yes, but that's different than, incendiary language of, that sometimes permits others with dark impulses to act like white supremacists. But that's different from just running on outrage or using characteristics that I think most people, I've had people come up to me, 2 Democrats, a waitress, an elder man, 82 years, says, we're Democrats, we voted for Trump. We're looking for someone else to vote for, and we think you're it. I saw a Republican put it on my Twitter account. He emailed me, said, I voted for Trump, but if you're the guy nominee for Democrats, I'll vote for you. How you run is how you can govern. I believe that. I don't want to be in the White House if all you can do is executive orders.
And finally, because I know you have to go, John Bolton was fired today. Are you relieved as I am?
Yes, I tweeted about it.
Okay.
And I said, That is a man who supported bringing us to the cusp of a strikes against Iran. That is a man who didn't want to move towards a peace accord in Afghanistan. And I hope they bring someone in who understands that diplomacy is what fixes problems, not our military.
All right. Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Okay, there you have it. Hope you found that interesting. If you appreciate any of this content, remember, please contribute on Patreon or PayPal, the links for which are always in the various description boxes where you consume this audio. And I will talk to you later.